Misinformation. Won't someone give me some true information? What about Fauci? Can he be relied on the subject of COVID and the pandemic? Hello there, you 6 million awakening wonders. Thanks for joining me on this voyage of truth and freedom. It's going to be down to you yourself to awaken yourself to the deeper realities, because the machinery around you wants you dumb and distracted. They will elevate dumb conspiracies in order to condemn critical thinking. Anything that contravenes the mainstream narrative will be bunched up alongside codswallop and hogwash. Well, let me tell you, there's a legitimate reason to question the mainstream media narrative around the pandemic, around reporting around COVID and COVID deaths. So why is Anthony Fauci, the dear doctor, going on your television set framed by the mainstream saying that the problem with COVID and misinformation is coming from people that are critical of many of his policies, or certainly policies he endorsed? Let's get into it. Almost 3 years since the coronavirus pandemic took hold, CNN medical analyst and Washington Post columnist Dr. Leana Wen has admitted the medical community is overcounting the number of COVID deaths and hospitalizations. Why would you do that? If you're engaged in a scientific endeavor, if you're engaged in reporting, if you're engaged in truth-telling, why would you overcount? How does that help anybody to understand and assess the situation? Can you see how anyone at all would benefit from COVID being presented as worse than it is? In an opinion piece entitled, "We are overcounting COVID deaths and hospitalizations," that's a problem. That would have been a conspiracy theory 6 months ago. You wouldn't have been able to say that. I think they're overcounting. Go, red flag, one strike. Just stuff that now people that work for them are saying. That doesn't mean that every wacky thing you hear is true, but there are things that are true, and those things we have to proliferate. It is your duty to spread this information around. It is your duty to share this information. Otherwise, the mainstream narrative wins. We're overcounting COVID deaths and hospitalizations. That's a problem. When cite sources that claim that most patients diagnosed with COVID are actually in hospital for some other illness. Wow, where did I hear things like with COVID and from COVID and the conflation of those things? Let me know in the comments below which YouTuber most prominently gave you those ideas. I'm not claiming it's me. Dr. John, where did you get your truth from? Remember, now on Rumble, we can speak uncensored. And I'm not over on Rumble going, "Whoa, I don't like these people that are slightly different for some cultural or racial reason." I'm over there telling truths that the establishment don't want you to know, but that you have intuited for a long time are absolutely true. That's why it's imperative you join us there, because they have been repressing aspects of this story. Wen had the backing of 2 other infectious disease experts who also believe that the number of deaths attributed to COVID is greater than the actual number of people dying from the virus. Thankfully, the truth is catching. She cites one expert, Robin Dretler, an attending physician at Emory Decatur Hospital, who estimates that in his hospital, 90% of patients diagnosed with COVID-19 are actually in the hospital for some other illness. 90% of these people are in here for COVID. What about that guy with his foot bandaged up? COVID. What about that person with a saucepan on their head? COVID. What about that bloke with a parrot and an eye patch and a wooden leg going, "Arr, arr, shiver me timbers"? See COVID? 90%. I mean, how often are these statistics going to change? This is 100% effective. The numbers keep changing all the time. If we're going to talk about misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, that has got to be a two-way street. Let me know in the comments. Let me know in the chat. When they convey misinformation, "Oh, it's a mistake. Sorry, we've changed our minds." "Oh, you mad conspiracy theorist, misogynist, racist, murderer." Hold on a minute. Well, how come you're doing it? Since every hospitalized patient gets tested for COVID, many are incidentally positive. If these patients die, COVID might get added to their death certificate along with other diagnoses. Hello, 2019, we've got your news story. But the coronavirus was not the primary contributor to their death and often played no role at all, Dretler told Wen. Did it have any role? No role at all. So it's irrelevant? Yeah. The doctor also cites another infectious disease physician, Shira Doran, who found that in recent months, only about 30% of total hospitalizations with COVID-19 were primarily attributed to the virus's Massachusetts hospital. Perhaps you aren't registering the absurdity of that information. Something that played no contributory role was added as their cause of death. What if it had been athlete's foot or a broken finger? "I'm afraid to say your husband has died of athlete's foot." What? Yep, athlete's foot. That's what killed him. What about that heart attack? Don't know what caused that heart attack. It would be a very good Agatha Christie film. "Sir, I put it to you that the murderer was that man there." What, Dave? I was with him all night. Also, I saw Stanley shoot him. Well, yeah, it could have been Stanley, but I'm going to put Dave down on the form. I've never liked Dave. During some days, the proportion of those hospitalized because of COVID were as low as 10% 20% of the total number reported who had COVID. So if misinformation and disinformation is a topic we want to discuss, then let's discuss it. And Anthony Fauci clearly does want to discuss it because here he is discussing it. Let's look at Anthony Fauci on the mainstream media. Two entities that are totally worthy of your trust and time.
Dr. Fauci, I don't know if you saw it, but on Monday Night Football this week, Damar Hamlin, a player for the Buffalo Bills, collapsed on the field. You're not an NFL expert, and you're not an expert on any cardiovascular issues the player might have had.
What I think they're doing here is pointing out that this athlete sadly died, and I feel like a lot of people said, oh, it's probably because of nefarious reasons. Well, evidently it wasn't, and I imagine what they're doing is drawing attention to this so that you can bunch together information like, oh, see, these conspiracy theorists, they say every time an athlete dies. Who knows what data there is around that subject? And that's why on this channel we never report anything unless there's reliable data. But what we can say is that people were being reported as having died of COVID when they died of other diseases, other conditions and other circumstances. That is misinformation and disinformation. So highlighting the more rococo and loco aspects of conspiratorial analysis and neglecting to bring to the forefront legitimate inquiry, legitimate doubt, evidence of dishonesty and dishonest reporting and inaccuracy. Oh, it shows me there's an agenda. Does it make you feel that there's an agenda? Let me know in the comments. Let me know in the chat.
As I want to do in moments like that, I kept an eye on Twitter. And I can't tell you exactly how many minutes transpired, but it was less than 20.
Look, I don't know how many minutes transpire. I'm a busy guy. I gotta go on the news next day.
Before people on Twitter began to say, well, clearly the vaccine caused his seizure.
Also, though, for some balance, according to this source and these doctors, 90% of people diagnosed with COVID were in hospital for another illness. Do you want to report on that just in the interest of balance?
And that had a multiplier effect on Twitter, as these things tend to do.
What position does this guy think he's coming from? I'm looking down from Mount Olympus at Twitter. Pooey, dirty little bastards. It's got a multiplying effect, as they tend to do.
What's your reaction to that?
What do you feel, Dr. Fauci? You must be so disappointed with your commitment to honesty and receiving royalties. How do you feel, you poor guy?
Well, my reaction is one of concern about...
Isn't it horror?
Isn't it horror? Can't we up that? Concern's not good for ratings. How about horror? How about rip open your top and show us your little Fauci titty boobs?
Borderline? More than concern?
Yeah, it's horror that...
Yeah, all right, horror. Yeah, it's actually got worse. That sounds like Anthony Fauci to exaggerate a condition just to make the news a bit more effective.
Misinformation and disinformation, when you have a platform like social media.
Yeah, it's got to be censored. It's got to be censored. Yeah, then that way people can't say anything except what you want. That would be good, wouldn't it?
Yet again, another conspiracy theory, complete nonsense.
I've got some conspiracy theories. You might be interested.
And that's what happens when disinformation disincentivizes people to get proper interventions for a threat like a pandemic.
Is there anything Fauci could have done different to end this division, this doubt, this confusion? Is there anything the mainstream media could have done differently? This is from Dr. Marty Makary, who is a professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and author of The Price We Pay. Dr. Fauci's agency failed to promptly fund key research during the pandemic. That research would have abruptly ended many of the COVID controversies that divided our country. Consider the question of how COVID spread. Was it airborne or spread on surfaces? Remember all those people wiping down their groceries? It lingered as an open question without good research for months, as Fauci spent hundreds of hours on television opining on the matter. On this question and many others throughout the pandemic, our problem was not that the science has changed, it's that it wasn't done. NIH funding for COVID research was also erratic. The NIH spent almost $1.2 billion on long COVID research, but virtually nothing on masks, natural immunity, COVID in children, or vaccine complications. Almost as if science isn't necessarily objective because only funded experimentation is getting paid for. Only profitable experimentation is considered worthy of pursuit. And if you have an FDA that's 45% funded by the pharmaceutical companies that is meant to be governing, and they find very profitable medicines, maybe there are certain outcomes that they'd like to tell their shareholders in the next quarter would be favourable. So why didn't the NIH spend money researching natural immunity? Almost like what? Because natural immunity is free in your body already, and Pfizer can't sell it to you. Can't be that. It's weird that the NIH didn't spend money researching natural immunity that's free in your body, or vaccine complications that might make their product look less effective and indeed dangerous. How weird, how extraordinary. But they were following that science, all right. A randomized controlled trial is the gold standard method to establish a drug's effectiveness. Yet remarkably for COVID, we still don't have randomized trials for so many drug recommendations, including the new bivalent vaccine, COVID vaccine boosters in young people, the optimal vaccine dosing interval, and the antiviral drug Paxlovid in vaccinated people. All of these things I've seen endorsed in the mainstream media, and yet it seems like, according to Marty Makary, that the trials haven't been completed. Because the NIH moved at glacial speed, most of our COVID knowledge came from overseas. The critical discovery that steroids reduce COVID mortality by 1/3 came only after European researchers did a randomized trial that Fauci's agency should have commissioned quickly. Similarly, a conclusive study showing that vitamin D, conspiracy theory, reduces COVID mortality, published last month, arrived 2 years too late. Wow, almost as if a theme that I'm spotting is profitable experimentation took place, but experimentation that might have reduced the profit didn't take place. Almost as if you have governing agencies that are somehow financially connected to pharmaceutical companies, even if it's in a tangential way through royalties, for example, that might inhibit an objective perspective. And when you have a compliant media that is to some degree funded by the same pharmaceutical companies and more broadly the same type of interest, and when you have a government that benefits from regulating and more authority, it's weird, isn't it, how all this has taken place? And if you point that out or question it, you're a conspiracy theorist. The Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA, the most widely circulated medical journal, recently reported its most discussed articles of 2022. The top 3 articles were on the discovery of mRNA vaccine particles in breast milk, myocarditis after COVID vaccination, and a study I led at Johns Hopkins on the durability of natural immunity. None of the 3 were funded by the NIH. All were topics downplayed by Fauci and other public health officials. So how can he go on the TV and act all objective and critical and condemnatory, almost sighing, exhausted that there could be such things as conspiracy theories, when it's been plainly admitted that truthful science has not been undertaken, that information that was downplayed, ignored, denied is actually true? There is no credibility in those arguments, and I feel that, in a sense, there's a mutual willingness to sort of hold on to it somehow, that people don't want to just go, oh no, so much stuff that we believed in good faith was true. And I don't even want to make enemies or villains out of these people. Let's just say kindly that it's a kind of institutional machine that, due to the nature of its funding, due to the nature of its relationships with authority, due to its pre-existing and converging interests with the media, is a kind of a behemoth that has its own forward momentum, like a type of AI, like a type of human algorithm that just responds in particular ways. Maybe we don't need to say, my God, this is actual malevolence. Maybe it's enough to say it's systemic thinking that led to a lot of deception. Let me know if that's what you think in the chat in the comments. On a personal level, many infectious disease doctors and academic physicians have told me privately they were afraid to disagree with Dr. Fauci because their entire career is dependent on NIH funding. Another problem. We are now learning through the Twitter files that US health agencies push for the censorship of opposing opinions from top scientists at top institutions. Health officials could have spent that time and energy conducting much needed scientifically sound research. That's corruption. And I mean corruption in the sense that they've forgotten what they're supposed to be doing, like a corrupted file, like it's glitching. It's not doing what it thinks it's doing. It's actually become co-opted by, I would say, greed, essentially. That the profit model has come to dominate the scientific model. Why are they still now highlighting, see, conspiracy theory, that geezer was barged in the chest. There's no way that was from a vaccine. Yeah, well, look, while we're being honest, should we deal with all of this shit? If Dr. Fauci wants to forever improve the agency he's now departing, he should speak out against medical censorship and publicly call for the immediate discontinuation of a White House internal policy that the thousands of doctors and scientists at the NIH, FDA, and CDC are not allowed to speak to the media. Medical discussion should not be a privilege hoarded by a select few agency leaders. That, to me, speaks of monopolization of minds, monopolization of mouths, so that the only minds and mouths that can operate are ones that have been co-opted. Mouths that say the right things. That's not disinformation, malinformation, and misinformation. Dissenting voices. Science that points to ideas that are outside of their profit model. All closed down, or neglected, or ignored. This is not objectivity. This is not what we were assured of. Remember the piety of people saying this is the disease of the unvaccinated. These vaccines are safe. Have the vaccine. You're not going to get this thing. All of this stuff. Now it's just falling apart. And the problem is that we're so engulfed in perpetual new information. There's so much bombardment, mistrust, distrust, conflagration, and opposition. We are unable to say, hey, let's stop a minute. This has exposed something really important about the way these systems systems are operating. I'm not saying anything that is not contained within these studies. Exaggerated figures, denial of funding for research that could have been done to help people. Do you think that it's just a coincidence that the way the narrative went was beneficial to Big Pharma, beneficial to the media who love a little hysteria, and beneficial to the government who love to regulate? Those are the three interests. You don't need a cartel at the center of it pulling the strings. Look at the evidence, look at the science, follow the truth, observe where the money was dragging that narrative. Fauci's agency failed to pivot its mammoth research infrastructure to give doctors and policymakers the medical evidence they needed at a critical time. In the absence of evidence, dogma ruled the day. The result has been the most politicized pandemic in history and a loss of public trust. Rebuilding that trust and a broken agency will be the charge of Dr. Fauci's successor. I don't know if this is anything to do with the lack of transparency. I'm holding on to a bit of faith in the system. Let's read this bit. An investigation by Open the Books reports that Anthony Fauci and the NIH received and hid $350 million of royalties from pharma companies. Either they did or they didn't. Either they received $350 million of royalties and then hid it, or they didn't. Do your own research. Let's open the books. Anthony Fauci, former director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, and the highest paid federal bureaucrat, received 23 royalty payments on top of Fauci's 2021 taxpayer-funded salary of $456,000. So there you are. Misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and outright conspiracy theories. Where to find the truth in all of this? I would say by conducting scientific experimentation independently of profit motives, allowing pharmaceutical companies to be regulated by a board that isn't funded by them, ensuring that when something as significant as the kind of measures that are undertaken during the pandemic era, that there are opposing voices included, that the debate is conducted in public, that you don't shame dissenters, that you don't smear them, you don't call things conspiracy theories simply because it's information that's at odds with your preferred outcome. Let's not assume that these people are malfeasant, even though looking at all this data, I can understand why some of you would reach that conclusion. Well, if you enjoyed this video, have a look at either of these. Remember, turn on the notification bell because the algorithm ain't our friend. It don't want you knowing the truth. It wants you dumb in little tunnels of, ironically, misinformation. If you want to see these things in full, first and uncensored, you can watch them on Rumble. That's why we're there, so we can speak to you freely and openly. More important than any of that is that you please stay free.